You are listening to Season 2, Episode 21 of the Faith Over Breakfast podcast. All right, this is Faith Over Breakfast, and my name is Eric Deepen, and I'm sitting, and rolling over across from Andy, who's staring at me like you're not doing any of those things.
No, you're only
who
sitting.
Who is pastor of Mission Church.
Yep.
And we answered a big question. Who do we listen to when they preach? Why do we?
Well, it's what kind of preaching do you like to hear?
That's very articulate of you.
Was it? Okay. Well, that was my question.
That was your question. A good question, apparently.
Yeah, I think it was interesting, and hopefully, as you listen to it, you'll be able to think through why you listen to what you listen to, why you're bored when you're bored. You'll get some insight into why we are as boring as we are when we preach if you go to our churches.
Yeah.
Or why every once in a while we get it right. So, hope you. Well, Eric, here we are, another Faith Over Breakfast, and you're wearing flannel.
I'm wearing flannel. You're advertising Arizona.
Yeah, you're wearing a Zoo York flannel, which is kind of streetwear.
Yeah.
This is not. I didn't see this coming.
You didn't?
No, I didn't see really anything coming. I wasn't thinking about what you were going to wear.
Right. No plaid jacket.
Yeah.
No bandana.
No bandana. Yeah. But, who knows. And, we're here, and we have discussed this topic about 0%. I texted you.
I liked
this.
it.
This is a... You did?
Yeah, I thought a lot about it.
Well, thanks for affirming that with silence when I texted you.
This
is an issue we're going to have to work through.
We can work through it right now because Monday, when you texted me, it's my day off. I actually put my phone away almost the whole day and didn't look at it.
That's good.
So in the evening, I sent out a few texts to people.
Texts.
Awesome.
That's the plural for texts. Texts.
Texts. I sent out some texts to some people.
Are you saying that way because of your Zoo York flannel?
Totally.
The texts.
Texts.
Okay. Well, anyway, so you like the topic. Good. So we're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
Great.
I might take it in a different direction, but I would talk about it.
That's fine. That's
awesome.
That's what we always do. So because we're not planned, because as many of you know, if you follow us along here, here's the idea: is we sit down, we don't plan. You just get to hear two pastors talking off the top of their heads, which has its place, I suppose. You're loaded up with some First Watch coffee. That mean you went out to breakfast?
I did.
Oh, with
myself.
With yourself.
Because I cleared my schedule this week. I have this new thing I'm doing where every 6 weeks I cancel most of my appointments. That doesn't mean I don't meet with people because other people will fill in some of those slots, but I have such a tightly packed schedule. I cleared it out, and I'm just trying to do some studying and catch up on things. And so I'm going to do this every 6 weeks. It's just going to clear the schedule and be able to reset myself.
Wow, that's cool. I've not done that.
So here I am.
Yeah.
You're the only one that I actually didn't cancel. Because I love this podcast. It's so fun to do.
Whoa, that's cool. Well, I swung by Chick-fil-A after taking my daughter to school and had the old chicken bagel sandwich.
Chicken bagel sandwich.
Multi-grain bagel that makes you feel a little healthier, though you know it really isn't.
Well, let's just talk about Chick-fil-A because they, get thrown under the bus a lot. But
do they?
In all of these storms, usually when there are people in trouble, it's interesting. Chick-fil-A usually opens up their restaurants and they tend to give away a lot of free food and let people stay in their places.
Everything we're asking Joel Osteen to do back in the day.
Yeah.
Chick-fil-A is doing.
Chick-fil-A's been doing it. I mean,
yeah.
That's a good thing.
That's a great thing. Yeah, and the chicken is delicious. I mean, that's, to me, the big question. If this wasn't a Christian-owned company and the chicken was equally as delicious, I would go there. Yes. So I am thankful for a good piece of chicken. That's really what it's about for me. And I like
equal opportunity chicken.
Yeah, and I like the pickle.
You like the pickle? I hate the pickle.
Yeah, I love the pickle.
Put the pickle
I could go for one more pickle. If we go together, let's put your pickle on my sandwich.
You can tell them one more pickle. They'll give you one more pickle.
That's probably true.
Yeah, just say
that's
one
a lot
pickle.
To remember.
Extra pickle, is what you say.
Extra pickle. Okay. Well, so I went there and it was great. There's a new one opening up Thursday here in town, and they're doing the 100-person camp out in the lot. And my daughter, who is old enough to be into she wants to watch YouTube constantly, and what she wants to watch on there are people doing 24-hour challenges, which means they like sit in the bathroom for 24 hours or something, which sounds terrible. But I saw that they were doing this camp out in the parking lot, and I was like, hey, do you want to do a 12-hour challenge that's an actual one with a bunch of people at Chick-fil-A? And she does. And it's Wednesday, which is a school night, and we're going to go for it.
Awesome.
And you may not get in, so we might, but check in with me next week. I'll be very tired.
Yeah.
Probably, because it's going to get super cold.
Because our podcast will be the night before.
Oh.
Or the day before, because we don't do it at night. But anyway.
Yeah. So
you'll need to get some extra sleep.
Yeah, and it's supposed to be like the coldest night of the week, which makes me think maybe a few less people will show up, which
One can only hope.
But everybody's probably saying that.
Yeah.
Anyway, there you go. Chick-fil-A. 5 minutes Chick-fil-A. Let's move on. So the topic here was, this is where I was coming from, is I wanted to know how you like to be preached to.
Yeah.
Not like, it doesn't need to be like name your favorite preacher thing, but like, what is it? And I guess you could flip-flop that. What do you not like? Like when you go to another church and preacher does this or that, what bugs you?
Interesting. Well, I mean, are you asking that question now, or do you want to pontificate on what you like?
No, I'm asking you. I actually have not formulated my thoughts on this. I will be just talking.
React to me.
Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, somebody who has spent 17, 18, maybe 20 years talking in front of people and preparing his own speeches and things like that, which means I've studied a lot of speakers and how they speak and that kind of thing. So,
and knowing you've done a lot more of that than me. You've dissected what other people do.
Yes, I do that. And so...
You said do.
Do. So sitting in an audience, it's very hard for me to not dissect what they're doing.
Yeah.
And how they're doing it. And so what I've noticed, so let me just give like a general, here's what I think is bad about the way people speak.
Okay. And
the way we have created that as Christians. We're going to talk just about Christian speaking.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't
sermons.
Because
we have a culture of, at some level, this thing that you've probably heard, that I need to go to church and get fed by the person speaking. So
which is why both of our churches have meals, because you can't make that excuse.
Right.
You are being fed.
You got fed. Like, I don't care what the preacher said. You got fed. I never thought of that. That's a great point. I love it. And it's totally thrown me off.
I feel like I didn't get fed. Did you miss the salad out there? Did you
not have the lasagna?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have this expectation, and we're analyzing the speaker to how he emotionally makes us feel.
Right.
And so, but also we really have created a culture of more what I would call an educated sort of seminary or college-oriented speech. That's what we're looking for. We're looking for someone to go, a certain segment of us are looking for someone to go verse by verse and really dig into things and bring out all the meaning and all that kind of stuff. Here's the thing. I've sat under some great speakers who do that.
Right.
I don't know anything they said.
Right. You don't remember.
I don't remember it at all.
Yeah.
And the reality is...
I remember very little of what I've heard.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the reality is that you will remember and put into action in your life the first 5 minutes of what you hear and the last 5 minutes of what you hear. And so I have changed as to what I enjoy. I enjoy somebody who is able to grab my attention for the first, 5 to 10 minutes and really tell me what I need to know, which then at the end can pull that all in and help me understand where I'm supposed to go with my life.
So why bother with the middle?
Well, here's the thing. So let's talk about two different speakers that I think are really fascinating that kind of studies on that in our church. One is John Piper, and the other is Andy Stanley.
Sure.
So John Piper, in general, is a really bad presenter.
These are not excellent speeches, right?
And I don't remember anything he's ever said, and I've listened to a lot of his sermons. But the reason that I remember things that he says is he's smart. They put the entire sermon onto the website.
Yeah.
and he's created a culture around himself where he writes lots of books.
Right.
So if you begin to listen to Piper, you study Piper and you read his sermons after you've heard his sermons, then you begin to learn the content that he's trying to present to you.
And I do actually remember some things he's said, and it's usually sometimes his analogies, or sometimes they're a little odd.
Yes.
But I actually remember those. Like, he has this one of like the holiness of God, which is a famous sermon in which he talks about trying to describe a rabbit, and explaining why we can't explain God. Yes. And I've never forgotten it. And I heard a message not too long ago where he talked about how God being the light was different than IBM personal computers. And he went off on this weird little tangent.
Sure.
But it actually stuck in my head, right, because the IBM personal computer oversells itself, and then it turns out you have to buy all these other things and everything isn't included. And he was saying God is not doing this. He does deliver on what he promised. Anyway, so that stuff.
And I would agree with you. And yet some of that is that's where Piper has it's not. That's more the exception to Piper than the rule. He has good things, but he's more academic. And the average day Joe sitting in the audience may remember the rabbit one because that's a good analogy.
Yeah.
Whereas with Andy Stanley, he's a master speaker. Yeah. Now, content-wise, if you're looking for a theological,
there's very little there.
Well, there's actually a lot more if you listen to his sermons, but
I guess I'm saying even by design, he only tries to focus on one thing per sermon.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So he doesn't try to unpack a lot.
So he did a sermon, and he does a sermon series, and he never does them more than 4 or 5 times. He did a sermon series on Judges, where who've read Judges a ton, don't remember Judges. I mean, Judges has so many stories, and yes, I've preached on a lot of them, so I remember them because I'm the speaker, and I've had to study them in detail and explain them and get people.
When you
to
do that,
right.
Which is why you can't really judge your own stuff, because you spent a whole week or 3 soaking in it. Yeah.
Yes, so
it's clear to you.
It's very different. But he brought things to light because he uses these images. So, like, if the story at the end of Judges where the prostitute or the woman is chopped up into a ton of pieces. Well, he used this, idea of bedtime. His whole theme was that Judges was bedtime stories and how horrible these would be as bedtime stories for your children.
Right.
And then he began to highlight them. So it was like, so-and-so in the Chainsaw Massacre. And, like how much that, well, it brought Judges to light. I remember a lot about Judges just because of his sermons. But I could have listened to the first 10 minutes and got all I needed. Yeah. And then I leave feeling inspired. So when I sit down and listen, I tend to want to listen to people, like if I'm going to listen to Piper, or I'm going to listen to somebody who's going to give me a more meaty, long sermon, I'm going to need to listen to it 4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
And I think like that, so when I go in here, if I go and I have no relational connection to the person, I'm going to sit down and listen to them, I don't want to listen to a Piper sermon. Unless I'm going to a conference.
Yeah.
Right? And it's targeted at me understanding some ideas and maybe having some, like it's a pastoral sermon. It's supposed to be academic. It's supposed to be.
Yeah.
So I think partly my thing is I believe that Christians, like pastors, have given up like an opportunity that they have to really teach people things. Like for instance, Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount. What do we really remember about that? Well, we remember the Beatitudes, which are the very beginning of the sermon. And even though it's not really the end of the sermon, like the Lord's Prayer is at the end. Like these are the 2 pillars of that sermon. Which kind of gets me, here we go, other than you can react to all this, but kind of gets me to the idea of discipleship, because if speaking is discipleship, and here's where I think we've kind of screwed everything up, is that in the Middle Eastern culture, if you were to say, like, if you got up and you're like, okay, so we're going to talk about X thing in Scripture, where you guys are in 1 John now, and we're going to talk about what it means to walk in the light. And you tell this amazing story about walking in the light, and then you begin to apply it to Jesus and what he has to say in John 1, or 1 John 1. you would pause in Middle Eastern culture, and everyone would get up in groups, and they would practice your story, and they would get your story down perfect, and everyone would help you tell your story about the light, and they would talk about Andy and Andy's experience in the light, and then once they got it down, they would stop, and you would begin to tell the rest of your sermon, and then once that chunk was over, they would practice it, because their whole job is, because it's an oral, culture, you want to be able to tell the story perfectly and pass it on. Whereas we're just like continually bringing in information, and
not only do we show up to church and get information, we take a jog all morning for an hour, and we're listening to someone talk in our ear, and it's constant, right?
Right.
Every time we jump in the car, podcast on, or radio, or music, which is all sort of information in my ear.
Right, and here's the thing: if you tell the rabbit story in our culture, so you tell John Piper's rabbit, you need to say that you heard John Piper tell this story about this rabbit. And so, because we are so much built on original, it has to be original, and yet Christian culture, nobody went and said,
none of this is original. Yeah,
like, this is copyrighted by Jesus.
Yeah.
They just said, I heard Jesus saying, blah, blah, blah. You can say, I heard John Piper saying, and then you can tell the story as your own story. Like, that's what Christianity is all about. That's what discipleship is about, is you giving a beautiful illustration that somebody else gave, and you do it in your way, and you offer it to people, and hopefully they take it, and they offer it to people, and it continues down the line in training.
Yeah.
So I like pastors who are actually repetitive, telling me the same things week from week.
Yeah.
Coming at it different angles.
That's something I've noticed. So I decided to listen to a lot of Tim Keller, and I know it. I know it.
Master at this.
Yeah, and I know it oozes from, but it's because I've decided to do that, and the reason I decided to is because I feel like he is speaking to a segment of American culture that most pastors aren't, and I thought I need to learn how to do that, so I'm going to listen to somebody who does that a lot. So, but when you start to listen to him a lot. And a lot of his sermons aren't even available for free, so I haven't listened to anywhere near the catalog. I mean, he's been preaching since the 80s. But yeah, you hear the same illustration, and he'll even say at his church, forgive me, you hear this, you've heard this before, but, and over and over and over. And then if he goes to a conference, he's using the same story, and I realized, he must know that you throw it out there one time, it doesn't stick. But you throw it out there 25, 30 times, and then somebody goes back and listens to it again, and then it actually might get stuck in somebody's head, like this idea, right? Yeah.
Well, and I think, so my argument right now would be is that Tim Keller on the East Coast, is speaking to a group of people that no pastors are really speaking to. Erwin McManus on the West Coast is speaking to a group of people that nobody's speaking to. Yeah. Both are master presenters. Yeah. Like when you watch them, just for their presentations, very different people.
Totally.
One's kind of he's Hispanic, he's Cuban, I think, and he's got Erwin. Yeah, it's funny. He makes jokes about his name, but you look at him, he's definitely something. South American, and he's not Cuban. He's anyway, Nicaraguan. I don't remember where he's from.
The cultural sensitivity level here is very low.
It's very low. Yeah, right? I can't remember. But and he's about the way he looks. It's L.A., right? And then you have the kind of the frumpy professor, New Yorker, definitely his culture. And then I think probably in the middle of the world, you probably have people like what's his name from the Village Church,
Matt Chandler.
That's kind of probably more Midwestern, speaking to.
And he's directly. I actually haven't listened to that many Matt Chandler sermons. But I listened to one. I did a wedding in Phoenix this weekend, and I listened to several different pastors just on my way there and back, just to kind of try some stuff out. And in this one sermon I listened to of his, he was very direct in saying that he was speaking to people in Texas who, by and large, assume that they are Christians. And so because of that, there are a lot of debunking of Christian myths in the sermon, and a lot of challenging, like, maybe you're not like just because you do this and you go here doesn't mean. And he said, he's like, look, we're in Bible Belt, Texas. So he knows who he's talking to, right? And Keller is absolutely not talking to those people. So he's not using assumptive language. He's presenting this potentially for the first time. And I've never listened to Erwin McManus, though I'm familiar with him, but I haven't ever
You should, and because what I like about Erwin is that here's the thing I like about both Andy Stanley and Erwin, and those are probably the two people I tend to listen to because of their capacity. They're master speech makers.
Yeah.
Is that particularly in Erwin and less Andy, people all over the world, in fact, theologians, people who are the more Piper oriented, they're searching him out and they're trying to figure out why he's connecting so deeply. And how he can keep bringing people into the kingdom of God. And so, like, if you begin to listen to how he speaks, he starts off as a motivational speaker. Yeah. And he opens like a TED Talk, but then he drives you really hard into Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's where he's, managing to grab people's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And both, I think, like both Keller and Erwin on either coast, like if you listen to them, different ways of doing things, Keller tends to have a little bit more, I would say, meat in what he's saying, but they both are driving community. Community is a big part of what they're talking about and doing life together, even in these huge churches. We're talking, I don't know how, I never knew how big Keller's churches are.
Well, and they just divided it into like 5 churches and they separated them all because it was too cumbersome.
Sure. So they're probably at the 10,000, somewhere between 5 and 10,000.
Well, it's over 5,000.
Right.
Yeah.
So these are big, big churches.
But that was cumulatively. So now, but still.
Right. Yeah. So community becomes a big part of why they have to speak, because you don't feel like you're part of community when you walk into a church of 1,500 people if you're going to one of those.
Right.
Things. So I don't know. So when I to go back to what I like, it depends. If I'm going to church, I probably want to hear Erwin. If I'm studying, I probably want to hear N.T. Wright or Keller or Piper or any number, any other number of Bible scholars. I tend to like to listen to this guy from the 70s on YouTube named Bob Utley.
Uh-huh.
And I like Bob Utley because he just goes verse by verse. He's a phenomenal, Greek and Hebrew scholar and historian, and so he'll just talk about what's happening in each verse. And it's a good way to, figure out what's happening in a passage from someone who's an expert on the passage.
Right.
On that. But I'm not going to, I've heard him preach at church, and I'm like, oh my gosh, half the people have to be sleeping.
Right.
And that's, that's what I've heard about, if you would go to Peterson's church or be in lectures with him, he's so boring, to listen to. Just not, you have to have a relationship with him.
Yeah.
To really.
But when you know him, you knew him, you wanted to hear everything he had to say.
Right. And that's a big part of listening to someone is knowing them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Andy Stanley stands out to me. I can't say I'm like a particularly like a fan, but what you can't deny is that some of his principles for speaking are good, memorable and portable, and every once in a while I default to his outline, and I usually am glad I do. When I go, well, that came across a lot better.
Sure.
But he, there's just things and I also haven't listened to that many of his sermons, but the ones I have, I could tell you, like, do for one what you wish you could do for everyone.
Yeah, that's great.
There's, he has this whole talk about that. That's more of a leadership principle talk.
Sure.
But that's his point, and he hammers it in, and I never forgot it.
And it just can be life transformative in the moment.
And I've exercised it, yeah. So, I mean, you can't deny the guy knows something about communicating to people. I went through a real Piper phase, and I went through that because I was in this kind of, I don't know, I was in like a smaller denominational church that, well, actually, it wasn't technically a denomination, but it was. But it was, they kind of wanted to be Rick Warren, but they just weren't. And it was somewhere in between, like kind of old school church and trying to be motivational. And I felt kind of just bored there, I think, truthfully, like with what I was hearing. And then I started listening to John Piper, and he was just so adamant and saying things I'd never heard before at the time, like his whole Christian hedonism thing, which he repeats over and over and over and over. And every single book is the same. If it's like, let the nations be glad on missions, it's just the idea that supreme happiness comes from God. Happiness isn't wrong. It's just that it's only found in God for all people. Missions, and then there's God is the Gospel, which is a summary of like all these other books, like The Dangerous Duty of Delight and Desiring God and all that is like, or what? No, doesn't matter. They're all just kind of the same idea, but that was new to me. That like this idea that God, that the human desire for happiness had an anchor in God. I never heard that before, and he just cared about it so much. I was like, wow, he cares? Like, it doesn't feel like anybody at my church cares.
Right.
So then I did that, and then I liked Keller and Martin Bond for a while, and Martin Bond has gone on to like seminary work, but he was a pastor in Santa Fe, and had not a huge church there, but he, like Keller, talked to the people of Santa Fe, which is kind of like has some Tucson parallels, I think. Sure. So he just, the analogies he used very different than what I was used to, and appealing to the arts culture, and that was helpful to me. But yeah, I appreciate, I think, a combo of two things, like deep. I like to know that the pastor has taken the passage seriously.
Sure.
But I actually would rather not hear all of their thought process. Like, here's why I think this means that, or even when John Piper will work out like the sentence structure, and I'm like, I guess that's okay, but help me know what to do. Thank you for doing that work. Thank you for understanding the sentence structure. What do I do with it? So I like to know that they've deeply reflected, but then I like them to give me something I can hold on to and actually use.
Right. Well, I think the hard part is, like, I think the majority of people who listen to sermons are visual learners.
Mm-hmm.
So auditory learning is their second thing.
Yeah.
Anyway. Right. And I'm an auditory learner, and I still have to go back and listen repeatedly to sermons. And that was what Andy Stanley changed for me, is as I listened to him over and over again, I just kept hearing him say, you got to listen to my sermon 3 times. You got to listen to my sermon 3 times if you're actually going to get it. I'm like, so I was like, oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Because what he's saying is, make this message, what I'm saying to you, part of your culture, part of who you are. And so I think I like people who tell me up front that what they have to say is important, and important enough for it's just not this, hey, half-hour talk we're going to have, but it actually applies to this whole community. And we all need to know this so that we can better do whatever the mission is that this church particularly has.
Yeah.
And that every message is that way. Because then when I walk in and I hear that, I'm like, oh, even if I don't go here, like, I could be part of something.
Yeah.
And I could be part of these people and what they're doing and where they're going. And that gets exciting. I want to be excited about what God's doing. I don't just want to learn.
So if you had to guess, what is the hardest part about being in your church for those who listen to your preaching?
The hardest part? Oh, well, I think there's a couple things that are hard to listen to me. One is sometimes I will begin to use big words that people don't understand.
Yeah.
And not theological terms. I've gotten away from those, but
sassafras.
I use sassafras a lot. People don't know what that is. So just using bigger words or using words that people just don't normally use in there. Yeah. So that's one. I think the other is I can get too many ideas built into what I'm trying to talk about.
Yeah.
And so it's not always flowing. But one of the both criticisms and compliments I've gotten from my sermons is that one person said, your sermon is like a rabbit hole. Yeah. Start going down it, and it's highly complex, and then so you don't know where you're going, and all of a sudden at the end you pull the rabbit out of your hat, and you're like, oh. Well, I think I lose a lot of people down
Yeah.
the rabbit hole, and
Yeah.
I've tried to change that
Yeah.
since that person has made that observation. And I've worked hard. I think the last 2 years I worked very hard at trying to create sermons that people could repeat to each other.
Yeah.
And tell each other about, and really articulate what I actually said.
Yeah.
Because I think the other probably thing that's hard is like, when you hit passages where you've tried and tried to figure out how you're going to explain this to people, and you're a little confused on it too, because it's not, and it seems like everyone else is confused.
Yeah, the commentators aren't saying the same thing.
And you don't want to skip it.
Right.
You also don't want to be like, hey, like, here are the 10 views of this.
Right.
You want to have a view, but you don't know what yours really is.
Right.
Not sure it's actually relevant, but it is. And so that, like, when you get caught in that in your sermon, and then you're up front, and you see people's eyes starting to glaze over, like, I could get stuck there. I think that's hard sometimes for people.
Yeah.
But what I've learned is really, if I'm excited about what I have to say, people will listen. If I'm not excited about what I have to say, people don't. Like, if it's changed me and I'm really excited, they will overlook, maybe the way I'm trying to talk about it. And because we're an interactive church, they'll ask questions to try to get me to clarify it at the end. So I think those are kind of where when I listen to myself. When I listened to myself back in the day, maybe 5 years ago, it was so slow in the way I talked. And I wanted to make sure I was saying everything exactly right.
Yeah, getting it just so accurate.
And then you go back 10 years and you're like, so you spent 15 hours studying, and now you're telling everybody the 15 hours of study that you did, and none of the presentation or structure. Where are we going? What's the application? It's just...
That's an interesting piece, and something I've observed is like when what I've kind of have been growing out of wanting to hear, I guess, is like, I guess I already said this, but all of your study is great, and I'm glad you did it. This is saying to pastors in general and myself. But, you did that not so you could just tell me what you did all week, right? You did that so that you could preach. And that's, I think what I want to receive is not all of your notes and how exactly you thought it through or whatever. I think, but on that note, I think I have this tendency to...
Brian keeps flying by.
Yeah, Brian. Oh, Brian.
Oh, Brian.
That's an inside joke, by the way.
Oh, this whole podcast is very insider.
It is. It's insider.
So you're just going to listen to two pastors talking about their job.
But I think I want so badly, and I love when I tell a story. Like my wife and I have trouble telling stories together because I want to start at the beginning and set it up, and then I want the characters to come in right at the right moments and kind of surprise you. I want you to be surprised the way I was surprised, so I don't want to give it away at the beginning. And then I want to finish it well, and I want that all to come together, and that takes work, and it tends to be a little long. And that happens it happens when I tell a story about, the weird, juggling guy I saw on the side of the road.
Right.
And that happens when I preach. Like, I don't want to get up and just say, so Jesus said this and that, and it means this, and so here's how you apply it. Right. To me, I want this whole big narrative to come together. And I'm sure that can be sometimes quite exhausting, and it's made for some long sermons, I'm afraid. Which I've heard, wow, that was long, and I've heard, oh, it was long, it didn't feel long. And I assume that when somebody says that, maybe they're more like me, that they like the whole story, but that's not everybody.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I don't know. I wonder, there probably are some folks that are just like, oh my goodness.
Well, I suspect if you told the long story, but you put like two visuals in it, then all of a sudden everybody will be like, oh yeah. They follow you along because there's this like visual thing where you got the attention, and then
right.
Yeah.
And sometimes I don't mind doing that. Sometimes I do. But there's this other part about telling the story and weaving it all together that for me, if I like stop and go, okay, so, check out this graph or something, it kind of derails the whole thing. Though that, again, may not be the case for others.
Right. Well, if you're telling a story with a graph, that may be different.
I know. Here's the deal. If I had a person on PowerPoint that could read my mind and the image goes up right while I'm telling the story and I don't have to think about it and say, hey, can you put that picture up there? That, like, having to do that just derails it for me.
Right, having someone else do it while you're going.
Yeah, like when I was a middle school director, I had the little clicker, and I didn't like having that many photos, but for middle schoolers, it was very helpful. Yeah. But it was great that I decided, because I would have it very specifically in my notes right when I would hit that thing.
Right. And
so I didn't have to stop. I would just be talking, and then there's up behind me whatever picture, and it just helped. But we don't have that system, so I have to go, hey, can you put the verse up here, please? No, the other one?
You haven't gotten that advanced yet. Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me. It's like, for instance, we are speaking on, I believe it's Daniel chapter 4, when Nebuchadnezzar has, the dream and he goes crazy.
Yeah.
So every pastor I've listened to people preach through Daniel. When you get to chapter 4, what do you preach on? You preach on pride, right? Because it's a nice big passage in the middle, or a couple verses about pride and him looking over his, great place. And so what you can do is you can go verse by verse and explain the dream and the significance of the dream and all that, and then Daniel's interpretation, and then really like this moment of really illustrating Nebuchadnezzar's pride, and you can talk about how that our pride and the humiliation. You can go through that. A lot of people do. Or you can open up your sermon identifying Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, right? That's his external problem that he can't interpret, and he has an internal anxiety because he can't interpret it, and so he's at a place of like loss, like he doesn't know what to do. Well, we all feel those things.
Right.
We're all connected there, and so if you open your sermon talking about that, then you have people. Then you can talk about pride. Then you can talk about all the things in the structure. But if you can capture people where they're like, oh yeah,
I need to hear this.
I know why I'm stuck. Like, I feel that. I feel stuck in a lot of places in my life with that anxiety. Well, all of a sudden now Jesus is able to be brought into that story, in a different way. And how I'm going to exegete the text is different.
Right.
And then all of a sudden Nebuchadnezzar's prayer at the end becomes a very powerful thing to connect to Jesus and all that. And you have a much easier sermon to get people's attention.
Right. And that's something I feel, at least it seems to me, that Keller does a lot. Is
oh gosh, he's a killer at that.
Yeah, you'll read some Old Testament passage and he'll just make this little blanket statement at the beginning. He'll be like, you see, what this is getting at is the deep inner longings of the soul. And you're like, oh, it is, And then he just kind of says, he'll just be like, because they said this, right? And so this is the feeling that it's like this, and you're just like, oh gosh, like I didn't realize that Jeroboam and I had so much in common, right?
And then he'll say something like, and there are really 3 things.
Yeah.
That we.
And then exactly, and then that's him,
like,
and he'll
like, where are these 3 things? And then he'll say them right in the 3 verses.
Yeah.
You're like, what?
Yeah, he'll go, there's 3 things here. Here's 1. Here's number 2. Here's number 3. The problem, the solution, and how we get it. See, there it is. Oh, and then all right, let's here we go.
Totally.
And
he's a master at that.
Whereas I feel like when it's just like, okay, so Jeroboam spoke, and by the word spoke we have the Greek word this, and what does that in specifically mean? And I'm like, okay, I don't relate to that. I don't.
Right.
And again, it's like, thank you for knowing your word.
Right.
But when is this going to get around?
If you're
going
to play the Greek word, you better play it well and inside.
Yeah, and it better be pretty surprising. It better be the thing where somebody's like, "Oh, I thought that meant." Yeah. It's like when you say the soiled garment. It's not just like, oh, there's some dirt on your pants. Like, this is like the I lost my bowels.
Right.
You know, like that's your righteousness.
Right.
You know,
You better have a picture.
The Greek word this, you know,
right.
and then the person goes, oh,
right, and then it's like
then it's hopeful. Yeah.
Well, I think the other problem is that, and I do this. You go back to what the problem of trying to listen to me, or maybe probably trying to listen to you or any preacher nowadays, is that we still view ourselves as sort of the heroes. So the stories that we tell are like us, about us, like our experience with this. And I think telling your story is good,
right?
But a lot of times, everybody in there is going, "Well, yeah, I'm the hero of my story, and I've had that experience too."
Right.
And yeah, they can identify it, but in some ways, it's like if I'm not able to say, "No, you guys are the heroes of a story that we're all part of, and I'm going to show you as we follow Jesus how to get to where we need to go." Like if you can change yourself from just being one of the guys to being the guide, like I really think like pastors have to think about being Yoda in the story. We have to be Gandalf in the story and stop being the hero of the story.
Right. I'm just trying to get something for our Instagram.
So what do you think like about that? Like, can you be talk to how I take a picture of you thinking like action oriented?
Preaching. There it is. Yeah. I think I used to not ever talk about myself. And so, and in doing that, I also didn't prep by asking, how has this landed for me?
Right.
So I believe I've had to insert more of that. And I've encouraged, in our church in general, our other preachers, I feel like the tendency, if we talk about ourselves, it's just self-deprecating.
Right. And that's what they mean at some levels. We definitely.
Yeah. And I can do that too. But we don't ever say like, here's a moment where I saw this, or this impacted me. Or we rarely do that, or especially if it requires vulnerability of us. Like, here's a time where I needed the mercy of God and how it came to me. So I've been trying to do that more and trying to encourage it more. But there is a danger of making it like the Andy show.
Right. You don't want to make the
Andy
show because then people don't know what to follow, where to go.
Right.
I think, and he's come up a lot, both negatively and positively on this podcast, but when I started preaching really on a regular basis, Mark Driscoll was doing it in a different way in the late 90s.
Oh, yeah.
And he told a lot of stories about himself and his kids, but what was powerful about the way he did things in localizing things is that when he was preaching, he would say things like, you, and he would name a group of people within his community.
Right.
The skater, goth,
right.
crazy people. Or the the hip, blah, blah, blah. And then he would speak directly to them, but they were Seattle people. They weren't
right.
if you spoke those to Texas, they would be like, none of us are that. He was like, he knew he had these subgroups, and he addressed them.
Yeah.
And he talked to them about their particular brokenness and what and I think that's a powerful thing of like saying, no, this church has a story and it has characters in it and it's going somewhere, and that's important.
Yeah.
And it needs to line up with Jesus and with this church's particular mission.
Yep.
And I think that's a thing that hadn't ever really, I think he was probably one of the first people to start saying, no, pastors actually have to tell the story of their community. They can't just be telling the story of the Israelite community or the early church community. It has to intersect. Like our community has to be part of this story, and where is it going and how does it relate to us?
Yeah.
So I think that was an important part. We could go on and on, I think.
And we shouldn't, because it's been a bit. So let's wrap it up. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah,
and
this was fun.
Thanks for talking, Eric. See you next week.